Brilliant. So, are we ready for the show? So last spring, Charles Krauthammer visited the desert, and Helene and I had dinner with Charles Krauthammer, and I said to him at dinner before he spoke, I said, "What are you reading?" He said, "I just finished Napoleon." I said, "Oh, Andrew Roberts." I said, "He's coming to speak at our Writers' Festival." He said, "It's the best biography, but Jamie, read his book on World War II." He said, "I didn't want it to end." So, ladies and gentlemen, straight from London, we have the famed British historian whose book became #2 on the London Times bestsellers, book on World War II. And tomorrow at 11 o'clock, he's speaking on Napoleon, which, as you know, won the LA Book Festival Award for Best Biography. And Harvey Weinstein's company has just optioned it for a major TV series. So, ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me in giving a warm welcome to Andrew Roberts.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be invited to address you at this keynote speech, and thank you very much indeed, Jamie, for those kind words. It's perfectly true that my book got to #2 on the bestseller list, beaten only by a book about Michael Jackson. I think it's wonderful that Jamie should have spent an entire year working on this festival, although not, it turns out, quite enough time to get a pair of trousers that matches his pinstripe jacket. Here we are. These things happen. In the 25 years that I have been writing and researching and thinking about the Third Reich, which my wife points out to me constantly is actually twice as long as the existence of the Third Reich, it has become more and more apparent to me that the reason that the Nazis lost was because they were Nazis. Adolf Hitler came to power because he was a Nazi. He set up and started the Second World War because he was a Nazi, but he also lost that war because he was a Nazi. On the 22nd of June, 1941, he unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of mankind. Over 3 million men in 160 divisions attacked Russia in a surprise attack. It was extraordinary that it was a surprise attack. Stalin had been given 90 warnings, no fewer than 90 warnings, including by the British and the Americans. And yet, the only person that he ever trusted, a man who trusted nobody, the only person he ever trusted, Stalin, was Adolf Hitler, the most untrustworthy person in the 20th century. And the initial attack was unbelievably successful. Over 3.5 million Russian soldiers captured in the first couple of weeks. Something like 40%, a little over 40% of the Red Army Air Force was destroyed on the ground, didn't even have a chance to take off. Its commander, Lieutenant General Ivan Kopets, committed suicide that afternoon, which in Stalin's Russia was a sensible career move. And for me, the most central statistic of the Second World War is that for every 5 Germans killed in combat, by which I don't mean bombed from the air, civilians bombed from the air in Germany, but killed on a battlefield, soldiers killed on a battlefield, for every 5 of them, 4 died on the Eastern Front. And so it was absolutely essential that front should hold, and ultimately, through the battles of Moscow and Stalingrad and Kursk, and finally Berlin, should be successful. And yet, the reason that Hitler started this attack was entirely political. It was ideological. It was a Nazi ideology, the ideology, of course, of the Lebensraum, the sense of the living space that the master race, his Übermensch, his superhuman master race, was going to carve out from the Slavic Untermensch, the subhumans that he despised so much because of his vicious and hateful and resentful Nazi ideology. The second reason, of course, was his loathing of the Jews. Over 50% of European Jews lived in the Soviet Union in 1941, and so he was going to be able to annihilate them. And also, of course, he was going to get to what Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister, called a final reckoning with the Bolsheviks, against whom he had been fighting on the street corners of Berlin for so long, and Munich and various other German cities. And, of course, it didn't go the way he planned at all. As I mentioned, 4/5 of the Germans who died there. And one of the reasons was the absolutely... Sorry, here, I always display the product. Was the horrific cold, the got down to minus 40 degrees, and yet, includes wind chill factor, and yet Adolf Hitler had not done the basic thing that one would have assumed that he would have done, especially, of course, as Napoleon had invaded 112 years later and come to grief in Russia, which was to ensure that all his soldiers had proper winter clothing. And the reason for this is his belief in the Übermensch, in the idea that his through Nazi ideology that German soldiers were inherently superior to everybody else. And he was, we get this very much from a quotation from the 12th of August 1942, where he was staying, he spent most of the war, over 60% of the war at the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, out in eastern Poland, now what was Eastern Prussia. I do recommend anybody who's anywhere near there to go there. So it's an extraordinarily sinister place. You can go and see the place that the 20th of July bomb went off. And it was there that he was talking to Himmler, and he said this about showing quite how little he appreciated the danger that the cold was going to ultimately play on his soldiers. He said this, reminiscing about the cold winters. Having to change into long trousers was always a misery to me. Even with a temperature of 10 below zero, I used to go about in lederhosen. The feeling of freedom they give you is wonderful. Abandoning my shorts was one of the biggest sacrifices I had to make. Anything up to 5 degrees below zero, I didn't even notice. Quite a number of young people of today already wear shorts all the year round. It's just a question of habit. In the future, I shall have an SS Highland Brigade in lederhosen. Anyway, of course, needless to say, once the temperature got down to minus 40, it was truly horrific. Goebbels had to put out demands that the women of Germany gave their mink coats to be sent off for the soldiers to wear on the Eastern Front. And the Italian journalist Curzio Malaparte was sitting in the Europeiska cafe in Warsaw, which is still there, actually, funny enough, to this day, when the German wounded came off the railway station and came through into Warsaw. And he wrote this. Suddenly, I was struck with horror and realized that they had no eyelids. I'd already seen soldiers with lidless eyes on the platform of the Minsk station a few days previously on my way from Smolensk. The ghastly cold of that winter had the strangest consequences. Thousands and thousands of soldiers had lost their limbs. Thousands and thousands had their ears, their noses, their fingers, and their sexual organs ripped off by the frost. Many had lost their hair, many had lost their eyelids. Singed by the cold, the eyelid drops off like a piece of dead skin, and their future was only lunacy. The next disaster to overtake him, within 6 months of this last entirely self-induced disaster, was his decision to go to war against the Americans. the 11th of December 1941, he declared war against America. And the reason he did this was also down to Nazi ideology. Astonishingly, he actually knew about the extraordinary productive power of the United States. He wrote a second book, as well as Mein Kampf, which a lot of people forget. It was published with the rather unimaginative title of Hitler's Second Book. And in it, he writes about the Ford Motor Company and the way in which time and motion studies were worked in America and the extraordinary productive capacity of the United States. And yet, in December 1941, he declared war against this country, which is uninvadable and which he had certainly no prospect or plans for invading. And he believed that, in his own words and in also the words of Ribbentrop, none of the Nazis, by the way, had ever been to America apart from Ribbentrop, who in the 1920s had come to New York in order to sell champagne. Somewhat unsuccessfully as well. But he believed, therefore, and everybody else believed, that he was the absolute world expert on America amongst the Nazis. And he said that because there were so many Jews and so many blacks in the senior reaches of American politics, he clearly hadn't seen the actual personnel of the Roosevelt administration, that therefore the Americans were not going to be able to fight. And Hitler himself told Molotov, when Molotov visited Berlin in 1940, he told him that the first time that if Germany went to war with America, the first time that America would be able to actually fight and put men in the European theatre would be in the year 1970. Needless to say, in fact, of course, the United States landed 250,000 men with Operation Torch in November 1942, who then, in the July of 1943, moved over into Sicily, and September 1943 crossed onto the mainland of Italy, and then marched all the way up, taking Rome on the 5th of June 1944, the day before the Great Cross-Channel attack. So he could not have been more wrong about that, too. He also, extraordinarily, again putting his racial precepts first, decided that he was not going to. He didn't need to go to war, of course, with America, because he had no treaty obligations with Japan at all. But he then, after he had gone to war on the side of Japan, did nothing about it. They didn't even exchange anti-tank information between the two countries. And this, too, was because, although at the time in 1937 of the Anti-Comintern Pact, various German scientists took Japanese skulls out of the Ethnographic Museum in Berlin and took calipers and worked out from this, entirely for propaganda motives, as you can imagine, that in fact the Japanese were an Aryan people. He didn't believe it himself, and he didn't actually try to coordinate with the Japanese. So effectively, there were two entirely separate wars that were going on at the same time. He also put politics ahead in his choice of generals. We know pretty much every word that was said in the Führer conferences from December 1942 all the way through to just a few days before his death in April 1945, because he had the stenographers who had nothing to do after he closed down the Reichstag instead take down every word that he and everybody else said in the Führer conferences. And so therefore we know that he listened. It's not true that the Führer didn't listen. He listened, sometimes for up to an hour, when men like Erich von Manstein and Erwin Rommel and Gerd von Rundstedt and Heinz Guderian, men who had worked and been in the general staff, who'd had senior positions in the First World War, when Hitler himself had only been a corporal. These men who understood and knew about ground strategy would be listened to by the Führer, and then at the end of about an hour or so, Hitler would do exactly what he originally said he was going to do at the beginning of the meeting. And so, after the bomb plot, after the 20th of July bomb plot in 1944, when his generals attempted to kill him, what he did was to trust those generals who were fanatical Nazis, men like Rendulic and Myrna and Krebs, rather than the people who were the best generals of the day. Another classic error of putting his politics and the best interests of the Nazi Party before the best interest of the Wehrmacht and the country. And then, of course, you come on to the whole question of the Holocaust. Between 1939 and 1944, the number of Germans working in war production factories fell from 39 million to 29 million, a drop of 26%. And yet, at the same time that he desperately needed people, he was indulging in the ultimate Nazi dream of trying to make Europe Judenfrei. He was killing 6 million of his most intelligent, hard-working, and well-educated people. It made absolutely no sense in terms of the war. And of course, one of the things it did was to, before the war, as soon as he came to power in 1933 and then onwards, lose the exact people who ultimately were to create the war-winning weapon of the nuclear bomb. Between 1900 and 1932, the Germans won, in that period just before Hitler came to power, the Germans won 13 Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry as against America's 5. From the period 1950 to the year 2000, with all of the great brain drain that happened from Germany and other occupied countries to America, when Germany also won 13, the Americans won 67. When I interviewed the military secretary, Winston Churchill's military secretary, for my first book a quarter of a century ago now, we had a very fine lunch, and he said to me at the end of it, "You know, I often think why it was that we won the war, and I keep coming to the conclusion that our German scientists were cleverer than their German scientists." So, what did you have on the other side? Well, the answer was a total contrast. Actually, it's worth looking at what was happening with Stalin at the time. Although, of course, he was a totalitarian dictator, just as bad as Hitler in many ways. He learnt on the first day of Operation Barbarossa, he had something like a nervous breakdown. He went back to his dacha. He assumed that he was going to be arrested, in fact, by the Politburo when they came to visit him. But what he was able to do was to allow his best generals, men like Rokossovsky and Zhukov and Konev and others, all the ones that he hadn't wound up actually shooting in the late 1930s, to exercise far more influence and power and decision-making capacity than Hitler was allowing his generals. It was he was effectively fighting Stalin a Western-style war. And what I mean by Western-style war is the way in which the combined chiefs of staff, the American Joint Chiefs and the British Chiefs of Staff, managed to have a system between them where they would have rows. Of course they would. When there's a marvelous quote from a historian called Ronald Lewin who says that there's no law in warfare by which men can die in battle, but that staff officers cannot be vexed. And these staff officers were vexed. You would have a situation where the chief of the Imperial General Staff, the man in charge of the British Chiefs of Staff, Sir Alan, later Lord Alan Brooke, would would be sitting in front of Winston Churchill, breaking pencils in half, saying, "No, I disagree with you, Prime Minister." Must be very off-putting to have a flinty Ulsterman break a pencil in your face. And of course, you also had the situation in the American Chiefs of Staff where General George C. Marshall, the US Army Chief of Staff, would bang his hand on the table in order to try to stop Admiral Ernest King, the head of the US Navy, from being even more Anglophobic and rebarbative than he was under normal circumstances. And there was one point where General Wedemeyer said that he wanted, during a meeting, to lean over and sock Alan Brooke in the jaw, in the words of his own diary. But the point of these great conferences, and you all know the names of them, Tehran and Casablanca and Yalta and the rest of them, where these 10 conferences where they all came together, was that the debates and the arguments between the people there were conducted in, of course not open because they had to be secret, but in the democratic fashion. Nobody was scared, nobody was worried for their lives or even their jobs. They said what they believed, and they stuck to their beliefs. And of course there was an enormous amount of horse trading that went on, but it was the democratic way of making war. Sometimes the situation could get so tough and hard fought that the room was emptied. Sometimes you would have 60 or 70 people in the room, and Brooke on one side and Marshall on the American side would agree that all of the vice chiefs and the assistant chiefs and everybody else had to leave, so that the 6 key figures were able to have it out. And this actually happened in the Salon Rosé at the Château Frontenac in Quebec at the Sextons Conference in 1943. The room is actually exactly the same now as it was at the time of the conference. And so all of the vice admirals and vice generals and so on went out into the next door room. And at the end of the meeting, 2 enormous blocks of ice were brought in. And Lord Mountbatten, the idea was that they were going to, it was a completely mad idea when one thinks about it now, but nonetheless it was a scheme, was to lasso an iceberg up in the Arctic and bring it down to use as an aircraft carrier, a sort of unsinkable aircraft carrier off the Norman coast in 1944. And in order to prove the capacities of something called pikecrete, which was a mixture of wood pulp and ice that they were going to cover this iceberg in, Lord Mountbatten took out his revolver and first fired into the block of normal ice, which completely disintegrated, proving that all the Luftwaffe had to do was to get one bomb on the iceberg and the whole thing would be a complete disaster. And then he fired at the pikecrete, the block of ice made of pikecrete. And in the room, in the words of Alan Brooke's diary, the bullet buzzed around the room like an angry bee. Quite what Mountbatten could have been thinking of, trying to demonstrate the ricochet capacity of pikecrete to a room full of chiefs of staff, is anyone's guess. But nonetheless, one of the young officers who'd had to leave the room a little bit earlier said, "Oh my God, they're shooting at each other now." One of the ways in which Churchill, in particular, was able to calm these conferences, and when they got particularly aggressive and tough, he was able to make everybody come down a notch, was through the fabulous use, of course, of his sense of humour. And there's a marvellous occasion in the November of 1943 when they were trying to get Turkey into the war. Not a very successful policy, owing to the fact that Turkey actually only declared war against Nazi Germany in March 1945. But nonetheless, remember that it's November, and the argument was whether or not they tried to coerce the Turks, or whether or not they should appease and suck up to the Turks and be as nice as possible and try to get them into the war in that way. And the debate had gone on and it had been pretty aggressive and tough. And at one point, Winston Churchill made, in my view, the fabulous joke, "Tell Turkey that Christmas is coming." So when you contrast, as one must, the kind of war leadership that one got from Winston Churchill, who was perfectly willing to, and we're about to play a clip, Aaron is going to play a clip fairly soon of a speech of Winston Churchill's, in which he does the exact opposite of Hitler. Hitler and Goebbels tried to pretend that there was no such thing as the bombing of Berlin at the beginning. When it became clear that there was, they ignored it, and Hitler, in fact, never visited a bomb site. He never had himself photographed anywhere near any bomb victims, and he actually had little curtains installed in his Mercedes-Benz so that he wouldn't have to see anybody as he was driving to and from places in Berlin, and that they wouldn't be able to see him either. So that was one way of dealing with it. The other way was to do what Winston Churchill did, which was to level with the British people, to tell them how bad it was, not to try to hide the horrors and the things that were going to be necessary, the blood, toil, tears and sweat that were going to be necessary in order to win that war. I'm just going to play you a little clip of his great "We Shall Fight Them on the Beach," his speech of the 4th of June 1940. The final paragraph of which is very short. It's only about, the last paragraph is only about 160 words. And all of them, very interestingly for the tricks of his trade, the sort of technique of his speaking, all of them are in Old English. They are words that come from the Anglo-Saxon dictionary, except for two. And all of the others are. So, Aaron, take it away. Never ever fails to send a tingle down the spine, that moment. And that paragraph where he goes on, where he starts to fight to the end and ends with "We shall never surrender." As I say, those are all of them words that can be found in Old English, except for the word surrender, which comes from the French. The major battles between the British and the Americans in the creation of the grand strategy were, of course, the timing of the cross-channel attack, which turned into Operation Overlord on the 6th of June 1944. And up until the Trident Conference of May 1943, FDR had supported Churchill and Alan Brooke against his own Chief of Staff, US Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall. Over the timing of that, the British hadn't wanted to go back onto the continent, from which, of course, we'd been ignominiously flung off at Dunkirk in June 1940, until they were absolutely certain that that wasn't going to happen again, that German counterattack was not going to be successful again. When I went up to university, I was taught by my historian, Dons, never to ever write the word inevitable, because nothing in history is inevitable, except for German counterattack. And when one looks at the history of German counterattack in the Second World War, one can understand why these men, who had, of course, fought in the trenches, Alan Brooke and Winston Churchill, didn't want to re-enter the continent any quicker than they did. But at the Trident Conference, FDR changed his mind. He supported Marshall, and therefore they came up with the date of the 1st of May 1944 to have Operation Overlord. And by that, it had to be put back, of course, because of questions to do with landing craft. But nonetheless, it ultimately took place only about 5 weeks after that. And that was the point, really, the absolutely right time to attack, not least because the Russians by that stage were crushing the Wehrmacht in the east. In Operation Bagration, for example, the Russians managed to kill, wound, or capture 510,000 Germans. So it was absolutely essential that we got back onto the continent as soon as possible. And the timing was really superb. By that stage, the Battle of the Atlantic had been won in the July and August of 1943. The Germans had added an extra rotor to the Enigma machine, plunging all of the Shark code into the naval code into gobbledygook until December 1943, when they were able to break back in and therefore send the forces to the right places to intercept the U-boat wolf packs. On the actual day of D-Day, such was the air superiority over the beaches of Dunkirk that while the Luftwaffe were able to fly 318 sorties, the Allies flew no fewer than 13,168. An extraordinary difference. The Allies had dropped 18,400 tons of bombs on Normandy in April 1944 alone, and they had the Mulberry Harbours that weren't ready in 1943, and the pipeline under the ocean, Pluto, which was to bring millions of gallons of gasoline over as well. So the timing by June 1944 was absolutely perfect. And so extraordinarily, the person who, of course, had the power by then was FDR. In the calendar year 1944, when Britain was able to build 28,000 warplanes, and the Germans and Russians were able to produce 40,000 warplanes each, the United States produced 98,000 warplanes, almost as much as the whole of the rest of the world put together. And so, of course, FDR was able to choose the timing and the date, and as it turned out, also, of course, the commander-in-chief for the attack. And it was a fabulously successful one. And just to conclude, another thing that strikes me when I read these books and work in these papers and go to these archives, which, as I say, I've been doing now for a quarter of a century, is there was one area that constantly comes back to me, and that is the way in which these great leaders, Alan Brooke and George Marshall, Winston Churchill, FDR, these are the people who decided where to attack, when to attack, under what circumstances, with the forces. You know, men like Patton and Montgomery and Eisenhower and Bradley and so on are very important figures, of course, on the battlefield, but they were only able to use the forces given to them by the four masters and commanders back home. And what they did was something truly extraordinary, I think, in that they all worried desperately. These are men who had pressures that I know we have very distinguished people here in the audience tonight, but I don't think any of them would for a moment claim that they have the kind of pressures on them where day in, day out, the fates of tens of thousands of men, lives and deaths of tens of thousands of men are on their decision, hang on their decision. And it was something that, despite the doubts they have and the doubts they express to their diaries and the doubts they expressed on occasion to their wives, Winston Churchill said the night before D-Day that he told Clementine Churchill that he feared that there would be thousands of Allied dead in the surf of the Normandy beaches. And yet, when it came to the press, when it came to Parliament and Congress, when it came to the public, when it came to their own staffs, they showed nothing other than complete certainty in ultimate victory. And that, ladies and gentlemen, strikes me as the very quintessence of leadership. Thank you very much. Thank you.